Right now, in January 2026, the state of Virginia is launching one of the most aggressive assaults on Second Amendment rights we've seen in years, and it's happening while most Americans aren't even paying attention. We're talking about a brand new $500 tax on firearm suppressors, dropped on gun owners just months after the federal government eliminated the NFA tax that had stood for decades. That's not policy. That's sabotage. That's a state government watching the federal system make suppressors more accessible and affordable for everyday Americans and immediately rushing to slam the door shut again with an even higher price tag. But the suppressor tax is just the opening move in a legislative blitz that targets everything from commonly owned rifles to your ability to keep a firearm in your own vehicle. This is the gun grab beginning in real time. And if you think it stops at Virginia's borders, you haven't been paying attention to how these things spread. The $500 suppressor tax and the bans that come with it aren't isolated incidents. They're the blueprint for what anti-gun lawmakers across the country want to implement the moment they think they can get away with it. So buckle up, because what's unfolding in Richmond right now is a masterclass in how state governments erode constitutional rights one bill at a time, while counting on you to be too busy, too tired, or too convinced that someone else will fix it to actually fight back. Let's start with the suppressor tax, because the timing alone tells you everything you need to know about the intent behind this legislation. House Bill 207 would impose a $500 state excise tax on every suppressor sold at retail in Virginia, effective July 1st of this year. $500. That's not a typo. That's not a mistake in the drafting. That's a deliberate, punitive tax designed to price suppressors out of reach for ordinary shooters, hunters, and gun owners who use them for hearing protection and responsible sport. And here's what makes this particularly infuriating. The federal NFA tax on suppressors, which stood at $200 for decades, was just eliminated. For the first time in generations, suppressors became genuinely affordable for average Americans. Dealers across the country reported them flying off shelves because people could finally afford a piece of safety equipment that protects your hearing without breaking the bank. Suppressors aren't the movie silencers that Hollywood invented. They're hearing protection. They reduce noise to safer levels while you're hunting or at the range. They're a tool that responsible gun owners have wanted access to for years, and the moment that access improved, Virginia lawmakers decided to destroy it. This isn't about safety. This isn't about reducing crime. This is a cash grab dressed up as policy, and they're not even trying to hide it. The revenue from this tax goes straight into Virginia's general fund, a slush fund that politicians control with zero accountability to the gun owners they're squeezing. And the structure of the tax tells you exactly who they're targeting. It applies to every suppressor sold to a civilian, but of course it doesn't apply to law enforcement. Cops get a pass. The people who are supposed to protect your rights get exempted from the same financial burden they're imposing on you. Dealers would be required to collect that $500 at the point of sale, meaning the state doesn't even have to lift a finger. They just sit back and watch the money roll in while gun owners pay the price. This is what happens when anti-gun majorities take control of state legislatures. They look at federal reforms designed to restore rights and immediately start scheming about how to undermine them at the state level. The intent of the NFA tax repeal was to make suppressors accessible. Virginia's response is to make them more expensive than they've ever been, more expensive than when the federal tax still existed. If you're a hunter in Virginia, if you're a sport shooter who values your hearing, if you're anyone who thought the federal reform actually mattered, this bill is a middle finger aimed directly at you. But the suppressor tax is just the first domino in a legislative avalanche that started falling on January 14th when the Virginia General Assembly convened and lawmakers unleashed a torrent of gun control bills aimed squarely at dismantling Second Amendment freedoms piece by piece. And the crown jewel of this assault is House Bill 271, the so-called assault weapons ban, that's really just an attempt to redefine commonly owned firearms out of existence and criminalize the purchase or transfer of guns that are currently perfectly legal in Virginia. This bill targets a wide range of semi-automatic firearms, including rifles, pistols, and shotguns that millions of law-abiding Americans use every single day for hunting, home defense, and sport shooting. It also imposes arbitrary magazine capacity limits on firearms that are legal right now, limits that have nothing to do with stopping crime and everything to do with making it harder for you to exercise your rights. When politicians talk about assault weapon bans, this is what they mean in practice. They take firearms that are in common use, that are owned by tens of millions of Americans, that are used for lawful purposes every single day, and they reclassify them as dangerous, banned items that you can no longer buy or transfer. It's a redefinition game, and it works because most people don't realize what's happening until it's too late. But here's the part that doesn't get talked about enough. And it's the part that makes me furious every single time I see these bills advance. None of this matters if the people tasked with enforcing these laws refuse to do it. I'm talking about law enforcement. I'm talking about cops who swear an oath to uphold and defend the Constitution, who are supposed to protect everyone's rights, not just selectively enforce whatever the legislature passes. If officers across Virginia stood up and said, "We will not enforce unconstitutional laws," if they put their oath above their paychecks, these bills would be dead on arrival. But instead, what happens? You get an army of enforcers who follow orders, who arrest people for victimless crimes, who turn law-abiding gun owners into criminals because they're more afraid of losing their job than they are of violating the Constitution. This isn't abstract. This is the enforcement crisis that enables every single gun control scheme to function. Politicians can pass whatever laws they want, but if cops refuse to enforce them, those laws are meaningless. So to every officer in Virginia who's reading this, who's listening to this, here's the reality check you need to hear. Your job is to be a constitutionalist first. Your job is to protect rights, not infringe them. And if you're willing to arrest someone for owning a common rifle or a standard capacity magazine, if you're willing to enforce laws that violate the Second Amendment just because some politician told you to, then you're not protecting anyone. You're enabling tyranny. And the path this country goes down when good people in positions of authority decide to just follow orders is a path we've seen before, and it never ends well. Now let's talk about the bills designed to destroy the firearms industry from the inside out, because that's exactly what Senate Bill 27 and House Bill 21 are engineered to do. These are companion bills that would impose vague and subjective standards of so-called responsible conduct on firearms manufacturers, distributors, and retailers operating in Virginia. If that sounds familiar, it should. This is the same playbook that New York and California have used with their public nuisance laws, a backdoor strategy to sue gun makers out of business without having to pass an outright ban. What makes these bills so dangerous isn't just the regulatory burden they create. It's the fact that they establish a new civil cause of action, meaning attorneys general, local prosecutors, and even private citizens could sue gun businesses for damages or seek injunctions based on nebulous terms like reasonable control or responsible practices. Those terms sound harmless until you realize they're completely subjective, undefined, and designed to be weaponized in court. A company could be following every law on the books, doing everything right, and still get dragged into litigation because some activist, prosecutor, or trial lawyer decides their conduct doesn't meet some imaginary standard of reasonableness. And here's what happens when you create that kind of legal uncertainty. Companies stop doing business in your state, they pull out, they refuse to sell firearms, accessories, even non-gun items because the litigation risk is too high. I've seen this firsthand. When I lived in Massachusetts, there were companies that wouldn't even sell t-shirts into the state because they were terrified of getting sued over something else they sold. T-shirts, grips, socks, non-firearm items that had nothing to do with guns, but companies refused to ship them because the legal environment was so hostile that even the appearance of doing business in Massachusetts felt like a trap. Now, every company can run their business however they want, but when state laws create that level of fear and uncertainty, you're not regulating the industry. You're strangling it. and that's the point. These bills are designed to shrink the firearms industry without an outright ban to make it so expensive, so legally risky, so burdensome to sell guns in Virginia that companies just give up and leave. And when they do, gun owners lose access, prices go up, and your rights get squeezed from every angle. But it gets worse because Virginia lawmakers aren't just targeting the industry. They're targeting you personally with bills that expand who can be considered a prohibited person in ways that violate basic due process protections. Senate Bill 38 and House Bill 93 would expand prohibited person restrictions based on household relationships, which in plain English means you could lose your gun rights, not because of anything you did, but because of what someone else in your household did. That's guilt by association. That's stripping your constitutional rights because of someone else's conduct, someone you happen to live with. It's an unprecedented erosion of due process, and it sets a precedent that should terrify anyone who cares about individual rights. Your rights are supposed to be tied to your actions, not the actions of people around you. But under these bills, if someone in your home becomes a prohibited person, you could lose your ability to own firearms even though you've done nothing wrong. And then there's House Bill 19, which expands the list of misdemeanor offenses that can disqualify you from firearm ownership. This one broadens prohibitions beyond violent or serious crimes and starts ensnaring people for low-level offenses that have nothing to do with violence or danger. It's a slippery slope that turns ordinary citizens into prohibited persons over minor mistakes, over offenses that don't justify stripping someone of a constitutional right. The assault doesn't stop there because Virginia lawmakers are also going after concealed carry reciprocity, one of the practical benefits that makes lawful carry viable for people who travel for work or recreation. Senate Bill 115 and House Bill 24 would undermine Virginia's reciprocity agreements with other states, agreements that currently allow Virginia permit holders to carry in states that recognize their permits and vice versa. If these bills pass, Virginia permit holders could lose the ability to travel and carry in states they currently have reciprocity with, which doesn't just inconvenience people, it actively makes them less safe. If you're someone who travels regularly, if you cross state lines for work, if you visit family in other states, losing reciprocity means losing the ability to protect yourself the moment you leave Virginia. And for people from states like Tennessee, which borders Virginia and maintains constitutional carry, this creates a one-way problem where Virginians lose access while their neighbors still maintain theirs. It's a deliberate weakening of the practical infrastructure that makes concealed carry work across state lines, and it penalizes responsible gun owners for the crime of wanting to stay safe while they travel. Then there's House Bill 40, which strikes at something even more fundamental, the right to build your own firearms. This bill would ban homemade firearms and unserialized builds, criminalizing something that has been legal and traditional not just in America since before we were even a country, but something Virginians specifically have done for generations. Building your own rifle or pistol, crafting a firearm for your own personal use, is part of American gun culture and American history. It's not a criminal activity. It's a legitimate exercise of personal liberty and craftsmanship. But under this bill, if your firearm doesn't have a serial number and doesn't meet strict state requirements, you could be breaking the law. This targets people who responsibly build firearms for their own use, hobbyists, craftsmen, individuals who aren't hurting anyone. And here's the reality that lawmakers refuse to acknowledge. None of these bills stop criminals, not one. A murderer doesn't look at a bill banning unserialized firearms and suddenly decide to turn over a new leaf. A violent criminal doesn't see a magazine capacity limit and think, well, I guess I'll go to church instead. These laws don't change criminal behavior. They criminalize lawful behavior. They turn responsible gun owners into lawbreakers for doing things that were perfectly legal yesterday. And when you point this out, when you ask lawmakers to explain how any of these bills would actually stop a single violent crime, they can't answer. Because the answer is they don't. These bills exist to burden gun owners, to make exercising your rights more expensive, more complicated, more legally risky, until enough people just give up. And we're not done yet, because there are still more bills in this legislative package designed to restrict your rights in ways that hit your daily life. House Bill 110 would impose additional restrictions on your ability to keep a firearm in your vehicle for self-defense, treating guns as contraband in circumstances where they were once lawful and where common sense should prevail. This is an especially dangerous attack on everyday gun owners who rely on their firearms for protection while traveling, people who drive through multiple jurisdictions, who park in different areas, who need the ability to defend themselves on the road. If you're someone who carries regularly, if you travel through Virginia even occasionally, this bill turns your car into a legal minefield where one wrong move, one mistake about where you parked or what property you're on, can result in criminal charges. Then there's House Bill 2129, which categorically prohibits weapons anywhere on the premises of facilities providing mental health services, with violations resulting in immediate forfeiture of any seized firearms to the state. Not a fine, not a warning, immediate forfeiture. You lose your property because you forgot where you parked or didn't realize the building you entered was technically part of a mental health facility. These broad bans capture unintentional conduct and strip rights reflexively, not because you did something horrible, but because you made an innocent mistake that the law treats like a serious crime. So let's recap what Virginia lawmakers are pursuing right now in January 2026, because the full scope of this assault needs to be stated clearly. They're taxing suppressors at $500 to sabotage federal reform. They're redefining common firearms as banned items through assault weapon legislation. They're attacking the firearms industry with vague nuisance laws designed to litigate companies out of existence. They're expanding prohibited person categories to include guilt by association and low-level misdemeanors. They're undermining concealed carry reciprocity agreements that protect travelers. They're banning homemade firearms that have been legal and traditional for generations. They're restricting your ability to keep defensive firearms in your vehicle. And they're setting up forfeiture traps in mental health facilities that punish unintentional conduct. This isn't incremental policy. This isn't reasonable regulation. This is a full-throated, coordinated attack on foundational Second Amendment liberties in the Commonwealth of Virginia, and it's happening right now while most gun owners aren't even aware these bills have been filed. And here's what makes this even more dangerous. Lawmakers are counting on complacency. They're counting on you being too busy, too overwhelmed, too convinced that someone else will handle it to actually show up and fight back. They want you to see these bills and think, well, the Supreme Court will overturn them eventually, or this will never actually pass, or I can't take time off work to go to some lobby day. That assumption, that complacency, is exactly how these bills become law. Because while you're assuming the system will fix itself, while you're trusting that the courts will eventually intervene, people are getting arrested, rights are being violated, and the damage is being done in real time. And let's talk about that Supreme Court assumption for a second, because it's one of the most dangerous myths gun owners tell themselves. The idea that even if these bills pass, the Supreme Court will just strike them down in a few years, so there's no point in fighting now. First of all, the Supreme Court doesn't take every case. In fact, they turn away most gun rights cases, even with the current makeup of the court, which is the most Second Amendment-friendly composition we've had in American history. So your assumption that they'll even hear a challenge to these Virginia laws is already on shaky ground. Second, even if they do take a case, you're looking at 9 to 10 years of litigation before it reaches the Supreme Court. That's a decade. A decade of Virginians getting arrested under unconstitutional laws. A decade of gun owners losing their rights, paying legal fees, having their firearms confiscated, facing criminal charges. A decade of real people suffering real consequences while you wait for judicial relief that might never come. And third, you're assuming the court will still be pro-Second Amendment in 10 years. The current court is not guaranteed to last. Justices retire, justices pass away, political winds shift. The makeup of the Supreme Court in 2036 could look completely different from what we have now. And if it does, that legal safety net you're counting on disappears. So, banking on the Supreme Court to fix unconstitutional state laws is not a strategy. It's a gamble with other people's freedom, and it's a gamble that ignores the most important truth about fighting government overreach. It is always easier to kill a bill before it becomes law than it is to overturn a law after it's been infringing on rights for years. So, what do you do if you live in Virginia or if you care about the future of gun rights anywhere in this country? You act now. You contact your delegates and senators immediately. You don't wait. You don't assume someone else will do it. You pick up the phone, you send emails, you make your voice heard, and you make it clear that you're watching, you're informed, and you will hold them accountable. You attend Lobby Day, which is happening on January 19th, just days from now. The Virginia Citizens Defense League, VCDL, is organizing this event, and it's one of the most important opportunities Virginia gun owners have to show up in force and remind lawmakers that there are consequences for trampling constitutional rights. I've been to Lobby Day multiple times over the years. I've spoken at several of them. This year, I have a scheduling conflict, but the turnout needs to be massive. Lawmakers need to see thousands of engaged citizens who refuse to sit quietly while their rights get stripped away. And you mobilize your network. You share information. You make sure every gun owner you know understands exactly what's been filed, what's at stake, and what they need to do. You use the bill numbers as ammunition when you talk to legislators. You force them to defend these proposals on the merits, and when they can't, when they resort to vague talking points about safety or common sense, you call them out. This fight does not happen in a vacuum. Every single one of these bills advances because lawmakers believe they can get away with it. Because they think gun owners are too disorganized, too apathetic, or too intimidated to push back. The more informed you are, the more engaged you are, the more present you are in this process, the better chance we have collectively of stopping these bills before they become laws that infringe on your rights for the next decade. And don't let anyone tell you these bills don't stand a chance, that they're DOA, that there's no way they'll pass. Virginia has anti-gun majorities in both chambers of the legislature right now. They have a governor who supports this agenda. These bills have a very real chance of passing, and when they do, the consequences are immediate and devastating. The gun grab is beginning, and it's not beginning with some dramatic federal law or Supreme Court reversal. It's beginning quietly, methodically, at the state level in places like Virginia, where lawmakers think they can chip away at your rights one bill at a time without anyone noticing until it's too late. The $500 suppressor tax is just the start. The assault weapon bans, the industry destruction schemes, the reciprocity attacks, the homemade firearm prohibitions, the vehicle restrictions, the forfeiture traps, all of it is part of a coordinated strategy to make gun ownership so expensive, so legally complicated, so risky that ordinary Americans just give up. And the only thing standing between that future and your constitutional rights is you. Not the courts, not some politician who promises to fight for you, your willingness to show up, to speak out, to refuse to comply with the complacency they're counting on. So show up, fight back, make noise. Because the alternative is waking up one day in a Virginia where suppressors cost $500 on top of the purchase price, where common rifles are banned, where you can't carry in your own vehicle, where building your own firearm makes you a criminal, and where the rights your grandparents took for granted no longer exist. That future is being written right now in Richmond, and whether it becomes reality depends entirely on what you do next.